He's going to tell us about his work on dispersal in red-cockaded woodpeckers.
Thank you, Craig. I'm very pleased to be back. As Craig said, I was a postdoc in Frank Patelko's lab, and it's amazing. I wasn't here that long, just a year, but the influence that experience has had on me in my career, all the people that were here then that I learned from, and even just the cohort alone in Frank's lab at the time, Walt Koenig, Ron Mummy, Dave Winkler, Russ Greenberg, Pete Myers, Steve Pruitt-Jones, people that have been friends and colleagues ever since, so I'm very pleased to be back. But I did head east and never to return, and started working on red-cockaded woodpeckers in the southeastern U.S. after I left here, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and I'm going to be talking about, especially about dispersal behavior. And instead of finishing with acknowledgments, just to make sure I don't forget, I'll start with acknowledgments. I've been working on these birds for 25 years, and so a lot of people have contributed to all the data and analyses that I'll be showing you. And some of the key people I'm showing here, two graduate students in particular, Sue Daniels and Aaron Hewitt, who some of you may know, who's a graduate student with me now. My collaborators in the North Carolina Sandhills, Jay Carter, Phil Dorr, Carrie Brust. 5 of the postdocs who've worked on the project in recent years, and many funding agencies and data collectors. So dispersal, everybody knows, is a basic demographic parameter. If you use the simplest of population models, dispersal accounts for 2 of the 4 parameters. And in birds, birth, immigration, death, and immigration, in birds generally we know a lot about birth, eggs and chicks. We know something usually about mortality, maybe not so much about juveniles, but at least adults, but we usually don't know much about movement in and movement out, dispersal. It's kind of the frontier of demography in birds. And a lot of people have argued, well, it's not that important anyway, we don't really need to know all that much about it to understand the biology of the population that we're interested in. With the advent of more appreciation for metapopulation structures, that's changed a little bit with population biology. Obviously, you need to know about movement if you have some sort of a spatial structure like that. In conservation, a lot of people would argue to manage a population, maybe you don't really need to know much about dispersal. Others would argue with habitat fragmentation, you might want to know how changes in the landscape affect movement. So there are different attitudes about dispersal. Ranging from people that just aren't that interested and don't think it is that important to understand, to those that think maybe at the population level you need to know about it, at least how many individuals are coming in, how many are going out. So that's one level to study at population level. The next level is kind of dispersal outcomes, know where individuals end up, where they came from and where they end up. You would want to know about that to understand metapopulations and habitat fragmentation. And then the ultimate level, in terms of detail, would be dispersal behavior. And again, you could argue, well, if you know the outcomes, maybe you don't need to understand how it is that this individual comes from here and ends up there. We don't need to know that level of detail. But I'm going to talk about all of these levels, and generally people would have some impression about bird movement if you don't know, even if you don't know much about birds. Some of it might relate back to former theory that individuals are probably moving to avoid inbreeding or competition. Dispersal rules, behavior is probably fairly simple, not all that complicated. Since they're birds, probably they can disperse pretty well. Cost is probably low. Populations are probably well connected. Impacts of fragmentation are probably not trivial. After all, we have bar-tailed godwits that fly nonstop from Alaska to New Zealand, 7,000 miles. We have blackpoll warblers that go from New England down to South America. How hard could it be to get from one forest patch across a field to another forest patch on the other side if you're a bird? You could do those kind of things. So, I'm going to start out by telling you what the main conclusions are going to be about red-cockaded woodpeckers. It is actually true for them that there's not much happening at the level of dispersal between populations. There's little of interest to talk about there, but dispersal is critical to dynamics within populations, understanding dispersal. Dispersal outcomes are quite complicated and interesting. dispersal behavior is unbelievably complicated. I wish now that I never had started studying dispersal behavior, because I was able to sound a lot more knowledgeable when I was just talking about outcomes and didn't actually know what was going on. And then the last point is that what I just showed you in the previous slide, pretty much the opposite of all that is what turns out to be true. They're not very good at moving. Maybe I'll go back to that. Do it. So they're not moving to avoid inbreeding. They're not moving to avoid competition. Dispersal rules, behavior is very complicated. Their powers aren't great. The cost is very high. Populations are not very well connected, and impacts of fragmentation are large. So all of that is false for red-cockaded woodpeckers. A little bit of background there. Cooperative breeders. A dispersal event, I'm defining that as a change in group membership from one breeding season to the next. Not necessarily to become a breeder. They could join a group as a helper, because they're cooperative breeders, but they're a member of one group and then they move to another group. I don't call it dispersal when it's a floater. They're in a different location, but they have not actually become a member of a group. Study areas, these are just the places I've worked and how many color-banded groups we have at those places. And basically all that's supposed to do is convince you that I have a lot of data to work with, especially from the sandhills where we've monitored 225 groups for going on 28 years now. I've recorded thousands of dispersal events. They're also an endangered bird. They excavate their cavities in live pine trees, an unusual thing for a woodpecker to do. They're strongly associated with longleaf pine habitats in the coastal plain of the southeastern United States. This must be the big map. It's going to take a while. Yeah. So they formerly, the colored places are the places where they still exist or existed at least in 2000. They formerly had a probably almost continuous distribution all the way across the coastal plain over to East Texas. But by all the problems that led to them being endangered, they've come to exist only in isolated populations, and this is pretty much all of them. There are a few birds here and there on private land scattered in between there, but not very many. That's mostly where they are. At the population level, the populations are in most places essentially closed or very close to it. For example, in the North Carolina sandhills, right now there are more than 700 adults in our monitored population. Only one of them is from somewhere else. All the rest came from the sandhills. Two other places that I study, Croatan National Forest and Camp Lejeune, which is a marine base. They're fairly close together, 19 kilometers apart. We only had one bird move between them in 8 years in that period, a little bit more in the 10 years after that, but not a lot of movement. They do occasionally go long distances, 200 or more kilometers from one population to another. Once in a while, one bird even showed up in Chicago one time, gray Critus, probably came from Arkansas, is the best guess about that. Found the only thing that looked like a longleaf pine forest in the Chicago area, which was an area of dunes that they tried to put Australian pines in and then decided against that, and we're growing the dune grass back, so it was dune grass with these Australian pines over it, but didn't make it through the winter up in Chicago. South Florida may be one place where there is more movement between populations. Reed Bowman studies them there, but generally not. They're closed. So at the population level, there is genetic exchange, and that's probably important to the genetic diversity that you see, but there's trivial effects of movement between populations demographically. There are not enough individuals moving to have any impact on one population. One population is not going to be rescued by dispersal from another. Okay, outcomes. So this is a male red-cockaded woodpecker getting ready to fledge. So one of the questions he's asking himself is where is he going to end up in life once he leaves the only home he's known, this nesting cavity. And if you look at the dispersal outcomes, there are several possible life pathways that bird could follow. This shows the first choice it makes in its first year. If it's a fledgling, and this just shows what happens to fledgling males from one year to the next, and you could do a similar diagram for females. A lot of them die. A few of them manage to get lucky and inherit. By lucky, I mean their whole family dies. They get to inherit their natal territory. Or they may stay at home as a helper and stay with their natal group as a helper, or they may leave in their first group and disperse. And if they're lucky, they might get a breeding territory of their own, might get a territory but no mate, join another group as a helper, or become a floater. So the first thing that they opt is whether to stay as a helper or disperse in their first year. And if they stay as a helper, then they may disperse later. They might inherit their natal territory, become the breeder there, but they might also disperse to another territory and become a breeder that way. So essentially, they could do immediate dispersal in their first year, or they could delay their reproduction and delay their dispersal. And if they do that, they're going to disperse in a different way. Dispersal by helpers is not like dispersal by juveniles. And going back to Jerram Brown in the cooperative breeding literature, these have been called, these two ways of dispersing. Stay in foray, which is the delayed dispersal, where you stay at home and you sort of monitor territories in your neighborhood and move to one of them. Or you can depart in search, which is the early dispersal that the fledgling class does. And they do have, they are different in how far they go. These data are transformed, so they look a little more similar than they really are. But generally, the dispersal distance for the juveniles is more than 3 kilometers on average. For the helpers, it's less than that. And it's the same for male and female within a status class. So female helpers and male helpers disperse about the same distance, and female juveniles and male juveniles disperse about the same distance. These guys have large territories, 50 to 75 hectares. So 3 kilometers is about 3 or 4 territories away. 1.7 is a little more than 1 or 2. So right in the neighborhood. And then you do get a longer tail, more of a tail with the juveniles. They can go longer distances.